Hey there, Board Gamers, Justin our Painter here from Deathra Designs, and today I'm going to show you guys an alternative way to paint flesh. In our previous tutorial, I showed you how to approach that with a heavy emphasis on utilizing an airbrush. Today I'm going to be showing you guys an even more advanced technique, not using an airbrush, and the effects are awesome. The miniature we're going to be working on today is a Space Marine face. Just like in our previous tutorial, we've got another Space Marine to work on. The difference today, however, is the techniques we're going to be applying are all by hand. Nothing's going to be using an airbrush. For today's effects, we're going to need a few paints. We're going to need some Screamer Pink from Citadel, as well as some Kerrbird Crimson, followed up by a little bit of Druchii Violet that we'll be using later on. Today we'll be using a Trinary of Flesh Tones from Reaper. We'll be using Maiden Flesh, as well as Elf Flesh, and some Suntan Flesh. Now, some of these paints are no longer in production from Reaper, so the important thing to note here, other than the techniques that we'll be applying with these paints, is that you have a dark flesh color, a medium flesh color, and a light flesh color. Now, I do think that Reaper offers an actual Trinary of flesh paints that does have a dark, medium, and a light color in there in one package, but this is what I'm going to be using today. I've gone ahead and primed the surface of this white in preparation for this tutorial. However, to get things started today, we're going to come in with some of our Screamer Pink. I've thinned this down on my palette. I'm going to come in and apply a coat of this to the whole surface. Now, it's perfectly okay. If your mixture's a little bit too thin, you can come back in for a second pass when this dries, and that's perfectly fine. Remember, we want to get nice coverage and a thin coat, so be patient with this and apply multiple layers if necessary. I realize this Screamer Pink color may be a little bit off-putting and perhaps even a little bit counterintuitive for approaching flesh tones. But bear with me, follow these steps, and by the end of this tutorial, you will have seen a transition and transformation of all the flesh tones as they come together. With our Screamer Pink now dry, we can come in for our next layer. For that, we're going to be applying some Suntan Flesh mixed 1-to-1 with Elf Flesh. Now, I have this down on my palette mixed up very, very thin, and also have a little bit of water on my palette next to it. Having the water available allows me to kind of mix paints or thin them on the fly if I find that my consistency is not quite what I would like. We're not looking for full coverage with this particular layer, however. We want to be able to come in with this paint and leave some of this pink color showing through. I find that having a really thin down paint and the water next to it to allow me to adjust the flow and get different coverage allows me to really push the depth that I would like. This next step can be time consuming and tedious, but be patient and apply multiple thin coats as necessary. Remember, like I said previously, we want to leave some of that pink color showing through. It's imperative that you come in with multiple passes for this so that you can get a nice transition or a gradient. The more layers you build up with this, the more intense the flesh color is going to be. Just make sure when you're building up your layers, however, that you are continuing to leave some of the gradient and the transition there. For example, if you're focusing on working on his cheek and you're applying multiple layers of this flesh mixture, that you aren't covering the whole cheek every time. You're building up layers and you're getting a more and more intense spot where the flesh is going to be brighter with each pass. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up, however, because I don't want you guys to have to sit there and kind of watch paint dry for a long time. Approaching the scalp or the overall dome shape of the head of a particular head that you're working on painting can be a little bit daunting. When you come in here, we're going to apply this really milky kind of consistency paint across the whole surface and try and build up the colors. Applying multiple layers and multiple passes is really going to be key here. Again, just like in the previous steps, applying multiple passes is going to increase the intensity of the flesh with every pass that you make. Now, if you find that you're losing some of your transitions, you can clean out the paintbrush while the paint's still wet and kind of sop up some of the paint or feather it or blend it out. Remember though, be patient, allow this to dry and apply multiple layers. With each layer that you apply though, make sure that you're leaving some of the previous layers showing through. In essence, as you're building up to the top areas of this guy's head or his scalp, you want those areas to be bright and the areas that kind of transition down the side of his face to his ear area to be dark. So with each successive layer that you apply, leave some of the paint on the sides of his face unaddressed. You just build up smaller and smaller layers until you get to that peak where the light source is going to be on his scalp. This particular piece is a really good place to start by practicing some flesh tone work, however. Because his actual head is rounded and there's no hair here, you're able to work on that curved surface. You can take the techniques that you're applying with this face, and you can use those same ones when approaching muscles and stuff on big muscular figures as well, because those muscles are nice and rounded. Now that we've got our first layer of flesh applied, it's time to come in for a second pass and really build up that intensity. You can see through the footage so far that when we initially put down the paint, while it's still wet, it looks very, very intense. Once it dries, though, we lose some of the overall intensity of the color. So applying multiple passes allows us to build up our gradients and our transitions, and also get that intensity or that depth in the color that we want. Again, be patient with this. Make multiple passes until you are happy with this particular coat, and make sure that you leave some of the previous layer showing through. You do not want full coverage on this. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you go for full coverage on this, you're just going to end up with one solid color. So practice your gradients, practice your layering, and build up those transitions. As we approach the top of his head for our second pass here, we're going to be trying to focus on the top areas where the light will hit and not on the sides. You'll notice as I apply this coat, I went right down towards where his eyebrows were, but I left a darker area where that transition is going to be. And I'm doing the same thing as we go across the sides here as well. With our second layer applied here, we're going to let this dry and we can move on to the next step. I'd like to reiterate, however, if you are not happy with the consistency at this point, you can come in and put as many layers on as you like and really build up that depth. But in this case, I think we're pretty good, and we're going to wait and move on. With our flesh layer now dry, we can go on to the next step. Now in its current state, this looks really, really nice, and this would be a perfectly acceptable tabletop standard or better look. It's got a very interesting, realistic looking skin complexion. But as you guys know, here at Deathray Designs, we make things Deathray difficult, so we've got a few more steps to apply before this piece is complete. For our next step, we're going to be coming in with some Kerberg Crimson Wash. Now I've thinned this down in a 1:1 ratio with some Liquitex matte varnish. You could use some Lamy and Media if you have some, but I find the Liquitex works just fine and you get a lot more bang for your buck. So we're going to come in with our thinned down Kerberg Crimson and apply a pretty generous but thin layer of wash to the whole surface here. Now this is going to tint everything, but it's going to pull all the colors together, and this is a step that I really enjoy doing. When applying this, you want to make sure you coat the whole miniature, but you don't want it to pool too crazy. So use your best judgment, make sure it looks cool to you, and if you find there's too much wash in any one area, just come in with your paintbrush with the wash removed from it and just sop up some of the extra wash and remove it. With our wash now dry, it's time to come in for the next step. For that, we're going to be applying our Suntan / Elf Flesh mixture that we made at the beginning of the tutorial, and we'll be coming in and doing the exact same process we did at the beginning a second time. In this case, we've got a mixture of flesh already down and a wash applied, and we're essentially pushing that contrast and continuing to build up to our lighter flesh colors. When you're applying this, make sure you leave some of the kind of purpley or pinkish parts down in the recesses and really focus on the high points. Again, this is a kind of a practice in patience. Make sure you go slow with this and build up the colors until you get something that you like. Just like we did with our first application of flesh, when we come in here to approach the top of the scalp, we want to apply a very thin layer of this paint and kind of feather it down the sides. Paying particular attention to his eyebrows and the sides of his head, where we want the transition from the lighter flesh to kind of bleed into or have a gradient into the darker reddish purpley flesh that we've currently got down. Now it is perfectly okay to come in with a cleaned off paintbrush and try and feather down some of that paint and get that transition here. It's one of the benefits of using this really thin down paint in addition to a wet palette. However, remember that when you're doing this, you can come in with multiple layers and multiple applications until you're happy with the transition that you have achieved on the top of your particular Space Marine's head. As I said before, if you're not happy with a particular color or intensity, you can come in and apply a little bit more of this paint. So perhaps this cheek right here, we'll add a little bit more just to get that intensity and that color brighter. And if you're happy with this step and you think this flesh looks fine, you can completely stop here. That is okay. This looks great as it is. But as we've said before, I make things deathly difficult, so there are lots of things I like to do, and we're going to move on with some additional steps. For our next step, we're going to be transitioning into just straight thin down elf flesh. We started with some suntan flesh as well as elf flesh mix, but we're going to be transitioning into the elf flesh now to apply our first kind of a highlight. Remember, we're doing this in layers, so when we apply this, we want to make sure we're leaving previous colors showing through and just kind of focusing and building up the intensity of the high points on this particular piece. And the consistency you're looking for with your paint is something akin to milk. Again, this is a practice in patience. You want to make sure you go slow and really build up these colors. When approaching the scalp again, we're going to follow the same techniques we did before. We're going to get this really thin down paint, and when we start targeting this Space Marine scalp and his forehead, we're going to make sure we're focusing on those high points and trying to leave a transition or a gradient. You do not want full coverage with this step here, or you're going to lose some of those transitions. If you happen to get some of this paint a little bit too far down near the eyebrows or the side of the head, you can clean off your brush and come in and kind of blend or feather it while it's still wet. As always, don't be afraid to apply multiple coats as each one dries until you get an intensity of color that you're happy with. For our next color here, we're going to be coming in with elf flesh mixed 1-to-1 with maiden flesh. For this step, we're going to be following the same techniques we did previously, but I'm going to be using a different brush. For this, I'm going to be using my Artist Opus 000. The reason I'm going with a smaller brush is I really want to get these tight, clean highlights here, and something smaller is going to give me a little bit more control and give me a little bit more of a precise highlight to apply. When approaching this step, just be patient, follow the same techniques we did before, except remember you're focusing on the extreme highlight. Make sure you're not applying full coverage, make sure you're leaving some of the previous paint layers showing through on your gradient, and you're going to get this nice, intense highlight on the high points of your miniature. Addressing the top of the head here can be a little bit tricky, so just make sure you thin down your flesh mix quite a bit and come in here and put in really thin layers and focus on the areas of the scalp and the head where you really want the paint to be intense, where the light is really going to hit it and make the scalp shine. Again, you don't want full coverage. You want to make sure you're applying this and allowing the previous layers to show through. For our final step, we're going to come in here with some ultra thin down Maiden Flesh. We're going to use this to hit the extreme high points on this model and really make the edges and the creases in his flesh and his forehead, his eyebrows, his nose, things of that nature pop. It is imperative that when you apply this, you do it with really small amounts because you don't want to lose those transitions and you don't want to overdo it. This is, again, the extreme high point. It's where the light's going to hit. It's the apex of where the flesh is going to shine. Don't go crazy with this. Be patient and enjoy what you're doing. And there we go. With our previous layers now dry, you can really see this face has come together. Now I went ahead here and I painted a little bit of the silver bits here, threw down a wash and applied some edge highlights because I felt the contrast between where the flesh meets the mesh and the metal portions here would really have a nice contrast and really accentuate what we've got going on. So I've gone ahead and done the metallics, we painted the studs on his head, and this really does show the contrast in the flesh we've got. Beforehand, when this metallic stuff wasn't painted, it kind of looked like a little bit of a mess, and generally when I'm doing a tutorial, I want to showcase one technique and not go too far with the details, but in this case, that silver really needed to be done if we were going to see the full impact of what we've achieved with the flesh here today. Alright, with the paint now dry and a few extra little details applied just to make things pop for you guys, I think this face is complete. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. If so, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ding the little bell so you get alerts when we put up new content. If you have any questions, critiques, suggestions, or ideas on things that we can do to improve, different techniques you'd like to see us work on in the future, or different miniatures, make sure you sign up in the comments below. We do love to interact with you guys, and we're committed to growing, we're committed to improving and putting out the best possible content we can. That starts with you guys interacting with us and letting us know, and who better to tell us what you'd like to see than the people who are watching what we're putting out. If you'd like to help support the channel, make sure you check out deathradesigns.com. Anything you do there helps keep the lights on, helps keep me employed so I can continue to produce content for you guys. If you happen to use any of these techniques on your miniatures and you'd like to showcase with us, make sure you check out our Facebook group, the TAP Garrison. You can interact with all the DRD team members there, as well as a bunch of like-minded individuals like yourself who enjoy painting and gaming, and you can get all the feedback you like. If you happen to not be using Facebook, but you'd still like to showcase your artwork with us, maybe consider tagging us on Instagram when you throw up a post. We'd love to interact with you over there as well. I'd like to thank you guys again for hanging out with me today during this tutorial. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, but as always, happy wargaming, keep on painting, and I'll catch you guys during the next video.